Okay. First, let me express my gratitude and thanks to the organizers and giving all of us an opportunity to interact with all of you. Okay, so as Marika said, I'm going to focus on a talk which is primarily, typical cognitive science, where we do experiments, and most of the results you will see are either reaction times, how fast a subject pressed a key, usually, or how accurately they were able to identify a particular stimulus that is shown on the screen. Okay. First, let me start acknowledging all the data that I'm going to present here. All the hard work was done by these students, Rashmi, Priyanka, and Asma. Let me start with the quote. I like this quote. I think many people do. It's from William James in his Principles of Psychology in 19th century. He started with, everyone knows what attention is. It is the taking possession of the mind in clear and vivid form of one out of what seems several simultaneously possible objects or trains of thought. Focalization, concentration of consciousness or of its essence. It implies withdrawal from some things in order to deal effectively with others, and is a condition which has the real opposite in the confused, dazed, scatterbrained state. So immediately you can see what James thinks is important about attention, that it is something to do with selection, focusing on certain aspects of the world or information, as we would say now. So essentially attention, for the most part, I will focus on this, is about selection, that how we select information in the context of visual perception, which is what I primarily study, from the visual field, usually for further processing. And generally, when people in cognitive science theorize about attention, they talk about two kinds of things. Processes that happen where there is no need for attention. Sometimes people use the term pre-attentive. It's supposed to be pretty fast, kind of fairly automatic. You don't really need to pay attention. And then this is information processing that occurs without attention being involved. And then there is, of course, the stage in which kind of attention comes in, and that leads to either better processing, amplification of whatever processing that happens. And to think about attention, one popular metaphor that is used to think of selective attention is to think of it like a spotlight. A lot of lights are here. So presumably the idea, or the simple idea, is whatever information that falls within that particular spotlight of attention gets processed better, or seen better, or heard better, or remembered better eventually. And information that is outside the spotlight is not processed that well, or not remembered better, or not, we will see, maybe not even seen sometimes. When you start thinking about the spotlight, you can then add on, and already I think David talked about aperture. An easy way, or another way to think about the spotlight, is to think in terms of the size of the spotlight. You can actually change flexibly the size of the spotlight. So you can have a spotlight that is kind of zoomed in, very focused, focusing on only a particular aspect of the environment, or you can kind of zoom out, and then you can kind of pay attention to maybe the whole scene in this particular case, in the context of vision. So people can actually do it even in the laboratory. For example, there is an early experiment by Allahabad which has shown that people can focus attention on a single letter in a bunch of letters, or they can focus attention on the whole word. And these leads to different effects. So one way in which people can study this aspect of zooming in versus zooming out, and something that I do a lot, so let me introduce the stimuli that will come again and again. These are called hierarchical stimuli, but essentially the idea itself is very simple. There is a big letter or a number that is made up of small letters or numbers. You can think of the big thing as global or whole. You can think of the small letters as parts or local. which is so the global or local is the terminology that I will use in this particular talk. And typically speaking, global processing is linked to broad scope of attention, kind of zooming out. And local processing is essentially zooming in, where you focus on the small letters, not the big letter. Okay? So by asking people to do tasks either with the big letter or with the small letter, you can manipulate scope of attention in the laboratory. So it's a laboratory task that is used to manipulate scope of attention. And when you do these tasks in the lab, one of the common findings is that people identify the target, the big letter, much faster than the target, the small letters. And this is sometimes called global precedence effect. Okay, so you may be wondering, what is the big deal about focusing in or zooming out? Maybe you just that more information gets in. If you zoom out, maybe less information or whatever it might be. However, there are recent studies that have shown that actually there is much more difference between effects, what kind of information gets processed when you zoom in versus when you zoom out. So for example, if you are interested in statistical processing, so for example, things like if I ask a simple question, are there more people sitting on the left side of the auditorium or the right side of the auditorium? Now, this task is not dependent on identifying a lot of information about any one particular object, but it's a kind of an overall estimate or picture of what is available to you. So such kind of tasks are very easily performed, or that is really what distributed attention or diffused attention, sometimes people use these two terms interchangeably, is what is good at. Similarly, when you see a scene, people can easily tell what is the scene about, even if they cannot identify a particular single object in the scene. The gist of a scene is recognized very quickly. And again, that is something that you can do with distributed attention. So distributed attention or zooming out is really useful for doing various kinds of things like gist of a scene, statistical things, identifying things that happen at a larger spatial scale, and so on. Let me come to emotion and attention. I think in the morning, by now all of you know how important emotions are, so I'm not going to say, but there is a lot of evidence to show that emotional information processing interacts with various other kinds of cognitive processes. I will focus mostly on attention, but there are a lot of studies to show that emotional information is remembered better, for example, in the context of memory. And when you have emotional stimuli, then you know that, for example, they are processed more quickly. They are also higher probability that they will be processed. And it seems like in the context of visual perception, I focus a lot on emotional phases. It seems like emotional phases are very special in the context of visual perception. They have kind of like a salient or privileged status in visual processing. They are processed very quickly. They are identified very quickly. And in the context of attention, they seem to capture attention very effectively and very efficiently compared to non-emotional stimuli. Many attentional paradigms have been used to check that, and pretty much in every particular task you will find that emotional stimuli grab attention much more quickly than non-emotional stimuli. And they also lead to consequent effects as well. So for example, if I show you a phase, an emotional phase, followed by then I ask you to do some other perceptual task at the same location, then your perceptual sensitivity is better. It has been done with angry faces by Phelps, Ling, and Carrasco. So it also leads to further benefits down the line. In terms of the scope of attention, that is, in terms of zooming in versus zooming out, there seems to be differences in terms of their relationship to attention. So more specifically, Negative emotions seem to be associated with focused attention, and positive emotions kind of broaden attention. In general, of course, as been pointed out in the morning, emotional stimuli are important because they guide appropriate level of processing depending on the particular context in which the emotional information is present. And so, for example, if you are in a positive mood, if you broaden attention, then usually it gives a larger advantage to processing self-related information. Similarly, those who experience positive emotions, they are also better at identifying the target at the global level. Remember, that is the big letter, compared to those who experience negative emotions. So there is a global advantage if you are in a positive mood. In contrast, if you are in a sad mood, then essentially it seems to bias or give an advantage in terms of local processing. So for example, if you are asked to make a judgment of shape, then people make it more at the local level when participants recall sad memories compared to when they were asked to recall happy memories, to put in terms of mood. Depression patients show a local bias. If you have sad cues, then they tend to reduce what are called conflict effects. Conflict effects are effects essentially where there are two pieces of information from the scene which kind of contradict each other, and when you are trying to respond to one of them, you tend to get slowed down. So these conflict effects are reduced if you have sad cues. Similarly, in a task that involves such conflict, typically what we call a flanker task, again, people who watched a sad video, for example, showed lesser conflict effect because they are focused too much on one thing, then the other flanker or the conflicting information is excluded from their focus of attention, and that leads to lesser conflict effect when they watch a sad video compared to a neutral video. Sadness in general, of course, to summarize, seem to be associated with more what is called analytical, bottom-up, detailed processing, whereas positive emotions seem to be linked to more, sometimes people make these distinctions, intuitive, heuristic type processing style. Let me just focus on three particular studies that we have done to kind of establish this link in the context of visual perception, essentially identifying facial expressions, emotions. Before doing that, let me just introduce one experiment which I think I really liked and led me to do all these experiments, but it's also important for attention and consciousness as well. So this is a study done by Mack and Rock, very famous. They asked people to do a very difficult task. You will see a vertical line and a horizontal line. They are fairly equal in length. The task for the subject is to say which line is longer. It's a fairly difficult task to do. And then after 2-3 trials, they suddenly showed one particular, another stimulus. In this case, it's a square, but it could be anything. And then they asked people, did you see anything? And interestingly, what they found was a lot of subjects said, no, I really didn't see anything. So it's almost like when they were paying attention to this task, whatever information that suddenly comes in, they didn't even see it in the first place. So that is why this is called inattentional blindness. Interestingly enough, when they showed various kinds of stimuli, in terms of emotional stimuli, which is the focus of this task, the effect was different. So for example, they found that smiling face, a lot of people did see it actually. Whereas a sad face or a neutral face, people did not see it at all, or not that many. So there seemed to be, even when people are not paying attention, the way they process emotional information seemed to be different. So taking this, we wanted to look at what happens when you have to shift attention from emotional information, in this context emotional faces, to non-emotional information. So we used a particular paradigm that is called attentional dwell time. But essentially the idea is, let's say that a particular emotional phase is presented either to the left side or the right side. for a very brief period of time, typically 70 to 80 milliseconds. Then a particular non-emotional stimulus, in this case a simple letter, you see a T there, presented either at the top or the bottom. Again, very briefly, so it's very difficult to see them, okay? What is measured is accuracy. We also did another experiment where the letter came first and the emotional phases came second. So you can look at the order, change the order. What you find is essentially, if you see on, well, you can focus on any one of the graphs, the effect is pretty much the same. But essentially, if you have a letter first followed by either a happy face or a sad face, people identify this happy face much more easily compared to the sad face, even at very short intervals within 200 milliseconds. To compare it with another task that Marieke talked about in terms of attentional blink, you actually get less attentional blink with happy faces compared to sad faces. Similarly, if you show happy faces or sad faces first, followed by the letter, then the letter is recognized if it follows a happy face much better compared to when a letter is followed by a sad face. Okay? Now, in terms of the global local stimuli, these are the stimuli we used. Let me quickly go to them. Essentially, it's a simple experiment. The idea, we showed an emotional phase first, and then followed by a big letter made up of small letters. People have to identify a particular target, in this case 6 or 9, and then they have to respond as fast as possible. Remember, they really have nothing to do with each other. So similarly, we also reversed the order because we wanted to show reciprocal interactions. Now the big letter made up of small letter comes first, followed by the faces. Here people have to identify, do both the tasks, okay? So the effects are pretty simple. You can see it. If, for example, you showed a happy face, and if you have to identify the target at the global level, then you are faster, so the blue bar is less compared to the red bar. You are slower with the local target. In contrast, if there is a sad face, then you are faster identifying the target at the local level compared to the target at the global level. If you change the order, again you get similar effects. If people identify the target at the global level, then they are faster at identifying the happy face. Similarly, if they identify the target at the local level, then they are faster at identifying the sad face. So it seems like there is a close link between global and local processing when you zoom in versus zoom out, and the kind of information that you are processing, whether it is happy or sad in our case. You can get similar effects, I think somewhat similar to what was presented before. This is a recognition memory study. Essentially, the idea is very simple. There are 6 letters shown on the face. People have to do a particular task identifying a particular letter, but there is a face at the background which could be either happy or sad or neutral. People do this task for a long period of time, and then after this particular task is over, they are then showed actually a surprise recognition memory. Did you see this face before? We are shown a bunch of faces. Now that could be happy, sad, or neutral again. And then we look at what exactly do they remember. Okay? Remember, they were not told that they actually have to remember anything about the faces in the background. Just focus on the one on the right. You can skip the other one. Essentially, the finding is very simple. People remembered happy faces. They can identify it with much better accuracy compared to sad or neutral faces. They were hardly remembered. The dependent measure is D prime, it's 0.2. So people really did not remember much the sad or the neutral faces, but they could remember the identity of the happy faces though, even though it is not even relevant for the task that they were performing. You can do the same thing with the global local stimuli that we have seen before. It's the same experiment. You have these big letters made up of small letters. On the background, there are either happy or sad faces. And then in one block of trials, they identified the target at the global level. In another block, they identified the target at the local level. And then after they performed this global or local task, we again give a recognition memory task. What do you remember? It's pretty clear. If they perform the global task, then they identify the happy faces better. If they perform the local task, then they identify the sad faces better. Okay, so to conclude, number one, there is strong reciprocal interactions between emotion and attention. You manipulate one, the other gets automatically changed. So it's not like they are separate things. And in terms of more specific results, it seems like happy or positive emotions in general is linked to more distributed attention, and processing sad faces or sad emotions in general linked to focused attention. Thank you.
Thank you for that really interesting and detailed description of some clever ways to try to disentangle the effects of emotions and our perspective on the world and their influence on thinking in the world. So I'd like to invite anybody on the panel to ask any questions or bring up some ideas for discussion.
Dan bagi lakya yunemen di panda resera. Dine ngi panda dan dewa bigi chwa chingju ji phera. Ta panda lai di chikina nyanga do ji thungi du kai sna. Ngi ge ne zu changbu changjang yin ba kan ki la panda me pe mang bo yere la. Panda yo kan ki la ne zu changbu ma pe mang bo yere ti ko la ne kyang gun chu kan de.
It seems that while listening to all the presentations from the scientific presenters, it seems that scientific evidence is the most powerful tool that you have. So, from my point of view, when you are looking after evidence or looking for evidence, and it becomes kind of too much, then I see there's kind of, I would say, danger. Because there are many things which are in fact true but have no evidence. But there are things which can be false, but you can have evidence to show it. So what would you say about this kind of situations?
No, what we are trying to do, of course, and I think others will add as well, is trying to theorize about specific mental processes and try to come up with ways to do experiments to understand the relationship so that we can come up with better theories of mind. So insofar as we have done experiments and all of us do experiments here, they do inform us. These are presumably, as long as we can replicate them, these are reliable results, so I don't think they are false as such, which we use. Of course, it doesn't cover all aspects of emotions or even all aspects of attention. There is a lot more we need to do before we fully understand either emotion, attention, or for that matter, any other processes that we are talking about. So in that sense, there is really a lot more work needs to be done. I don't know.
I have a different question for you, which is, when your studies presented people with facial expressions from other people, and the way you introduced the study is that you were looking at the dynamical interactions between a felt emotion and an attentional process. But really, looking at somebody else's emotion doesn't mean that I feel that emotion. So if I look at a smile, I may feel a sense of affection. I may feel like it's an opportunity to be social or to cooperate, but that's not the same as feeling pleasure. And when I look at a sad face, I'm not feeling sad necessarily. In fact, if I'm one of our panelists over here, I'm feeling compassion, and I'm feeling maybe a sense of of wish to alleviate that sadness. And so I'm just interested in your thoughts on what you're really measuring. Because as you know, left and right hemisphere are also distinguished in terms of their sort of global and local processing and their approach and withdrawal orientation. So I'm wondering if the left, which is sort of facilitated by the sad faces and the local processing, is an approach. It's an approach to the sad face that's really happening, not a feeling of sadness.
The first part of the question, I agree. All the three studies that I showed at the end are all about visual perception. They are not about felt emotions at all. And, so I'm not saying anything about what the subjects felt. However, there are other studies where people have manipulated moods, for example, and have found similar effects, which I described. But most of them I have not done them myself. But there is similar results. So you get results both in terms of felt emotions as well as processing emotional information. There is confirmation in terms of the results that we get. There is really no contradiction there. Although my experiments are not about felt emotions. Coming to the second part of the question, yes, there are lateral asymmetries. There are lateral asymmetries associated with both global and local processing. There is a separate literature. There is also, in terms of left versus right, in terms of emotions. So we have done some experiments, and what we find typically is that, at least in the experiments that we have done, happy emotions or positive, actually happy facial expression is actually not lateralized that much. It's actually not lateralized at all in our perception studies, at least. It's really the sad expression that is more lateralized. So it's almost like, and we consistently find that there is almost a genuine advantage for processing happy expressions across many paradigms that we have tried. This is somewhat different from the initial emotion attention studies in the 90s, which really focused on advantage for negative facial expressions. You may remember the anger in the face crowd effect and all that, but they were all done with poorly controlled stimuli for the most part, or schematic stimuli. As we shifted more and more towards realistic faces, and we have done another study with dynamically changing facial expression, there's a clear-cut advantage. We almost think it's an evolutionary advantage for happy facial expressions across the board.
Great talk. And I really enjoyed the specifics of the and tight experimental designs within your studies that you presented. My question, coming from a clinical perspective, would be, given this, and given a lot of the talk today and yesterday and tomorrow about meditation and the focus and attention within meditation, how would you translate your findings into a clinical recommendation? I know it's a jump, but if you were to interpret it towards one or another clinical direction, or an area of future research more clinically, what would you say that would be? And would it be different for folks who are depressed, given a lot of this findings surrounding sad faces specifically?
So for example, we already know, or some studies have shown, that depression patients show a local bias. So one of the interesting things is that maybe they need, or if I have to recommend a meditation technique, which I will not, but if I have to, I would say that they should probably pick a meditation technique that is not very focused attention type meditation technique, but rather something that involves much more, open-minded, more distributed attention type meditation technique. And of course that needs to be checked out whether that actually works better or not, but you can do that step.
다들인데 걔라가 디 샘조르다 이지 바라니 괜찮아시 달다 그 몽시 지나서 진짜니게 좋아디 좋아되던 좋아지 쉬인 삼선 아니 지단게 나랑서 남바상게벨 차샤비나 좋아시들 리주르다 샘조르지제 남바니 시에는 거요리 그다음에나 리주르라 차샤비나 그다 궁에게 시베게 시발라데네 기베게 좋아도들라 리주르지제 시에는 거래 당나시 샘조르들 차샤비나 일루티네 기베게 아니 생게 남도 상엘레 중요하도들라 아니 샘조르지제 드리기 남바시에거리 제가 아니 디네 숨비기 다지단기 초와스디 키난데 아니 초와스 근제질은 샤비나 선디 트와디
Since your presentation is related with emotion and attention, so when we talk about emotion, what is the relation between emotion and the feelings? What is the differences between feeling and emotions? For example, in Buddhism, when we talk about feelings, we can talk about feelings related with physical stimulus and feelings related with mental stimulus. And so I think in Tibetan term for emotion, we said kind of a mental feeling kind of. So how would you relate these three things together?
Emotions, I think for all of us is a feeling, but in addition, of course, we have, as discussed in the morning, thoughts associated with those feelings as well, but definitely emotion is a feeling, I think, or as a perception or an experience, whichever term that one would want to use. What was the other question?
How physical feeling and mental feeling and emotions are related, and they are different or same thing? I think basically you said.
I mean, by physical feelings, I presume
caused by the physical stimulus.
So lots of emotional feelings are caused by physical stimuli. They could. They are also caused by other mental states as well. But I don't know whether we are at a position to distinguish in terms of feelings. I'm not sure. Possible, but I don't think there is any scientific study that has shown they are different or anything like that. Unless...
Of course, in terms of the physical correlates of emotion, we can measure some things like heart rate variability, different hormones that arise in conjunction with certain emotions, especially arousal, which forms a component of many emotions. In that sense, I don't think we can, on the basis of those physiological indices, really distinguish many different emotions, but we can say something about the intensity of an emotion.
And I would also just note the importance of looking at both, because there is quite a disconnect between the physiological response and the emotional or kind of mental response to things like anxiety, for example, where physiologically, in some circumstances, you don't see anything. But in their mind, they have a very different reaction.
Attention, the emotion called emotion la du gala da dong nam ju to na ha bu na ta nga zo shen gi tuen do mi ju da ya jo la di da ran ni gi tuen do mi ju da ya de la ne ge la nam ju to na sa ku.
So you talk about emotions related with facial expressions. So can we recognize or tell about the state of emotions just by looking at the physical expressions or facial expressions? For example, we can have a very sad and with teary face. Can you say teary face? Expression when see somebody in kind of like difficult situation. And that mental state is related with a kind of compassion. And you can also have the same facial expression when you are actually very sad. So how you can describe these two same facial expressions with two different mental states?
At this point, I can't think of any study that has differentiated these two things at all, to be honest. So that would be a future study for us to do. I'm sorry about that.
I could add to that. The face is only one mechanism or one tool for expressing emotions. And the expression part of emotion is a very important aspect of emotion, a purpose. One of the reasons we have emotions is to communicate them to other people. There are other modalities that we use for emotion expression, like perhaps your physical posture. So when we try to understand the emotion of pride, there's a researcher who has suggested that to understand it, we have to see the shoulders back and the chest out and the chin up, not just the smile, right? Another modality that we use to express emotion is the voice. So you might see a very sad face, and in one case I go, oh, and in the other case I go, but the sound, one is my sadness and the other is my compassion. So we have to look at many different ways of expressing the voice, the face, the body, and with all of that together we can come up with a clearer distinction between the different kinds of emotions that people express. And there are many researchers who study emotion expression by looking at these signals and measuring how good people are at detecting the meaning of these signals when they're expressed.
Oh, one last thing. I have a former student who did a comprehensive analysis of the accuracy of reading people's faces. In the West, healthy women are better at discerning emotions in men and women that they look at than men. Healthy men and women are better than depressed men and women. So if you have depression, you have a deficit at discerning facial expression. But the subgroup that was the weakest were depressed women. So depressed women were dissociably worse at sensing the facial expression of others. So facial expressions did not seem to be a characteristic of depressed men, but it was a signature of depressed women.
Tana korangi di jushi di la ani senzu da yele chibani gi derwa la di sheshra. Dewa da yiri ani digi dewa de ha ko ne ani dumje khara ya yorisra. Ha mauna nga zu kares chedu yoristi.
I think this question is to some extent similar to what he said. So you talk about the binary relation between emotion and attention. So with that kind of knowledge, what there is to benefit from that knowledge?
Well, the first benefit or the reason why I do this research is to understand how the mind works so that we can come up with benefits. Maybe not today, but tomorrow. So, well, immediately there may or may not be any benefits, but I think you already saw some of the benefits in the morning talks, not necessarily in this talks, related to studies that manipulate emotions and look at other processes as well. So I do think there are benefits which are even there at this point in time, but may not be in my own presentation itself because I do not work with patients or other populations.
I'd just like to say, not being a philosopher, but I will speak philosophically, that I think it's very, very interesting that your findings repeatedly exhibit a preference or a privilege towards attending to smiling faces, because there are many different ideas about human beings and why we're here and what we're supposed to do. And some people think very darkly that humans are just here to fight, to kill their enemies, and to look for danger. But the data that we just saw suggests, in fact, maybe we are not designed that way, but in fact we're designed to look for opportunities, for partnership, for cooperation, and for working together. So that to me feels like a really important insight that we can learn from looking at this kind of research.